Hey guys, Andrew Dowling here, Mitch Kurtz, and thanks for joining us for another episode of the AltMed podcast. Make sure to hit like and subscribe to stay up to date with all that we have coming. All things AltMed? Yeah, that too. Okay. Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the AltMed podcast. My name's Andrew Dowling. With me as always, Mitch Kurtz, who I can see his face is beaming on this lovely morning in Melbourne. Our guest is joining us from Sydney today. We're going to hit a topic that we've been very excited to talk about for some time, but it's particularly topical at the moment in light of the TGA's recent down-scheduling decision with respect to psilocybin and also MDMA. It is co-founder of Psylo, Mr. Sam Banister, joining us from Sydney. How are you, Sam?
Yeah, really well, Andrew. Yeah, great to see you both.
Thank you so much for joining us. I imagine your phone has been running a little bit hot over this last little while since that decision came down. It seemed to kind of come out of the blue. I remember the last time the TGA was contemplating a down schedule decision, there was a whole lot of fanfare and lead up to it, and then they disappointed everyone, bit of an anticlimax. And then on this occasion, I was actually at a wedding, and someone just showed me a little news grab about it, and I was just thinking, goodness me, that's just come out of nowhere seemingly. But you probably had your finger on the pulse and knew that it was coming.
No, I think everyone that I've spoken to, from researchers in the space through to clinicians and people sort of more on the advocacy side, I think everyone was completely shocked by this. So
Mm.
you had the TGA essentially opposing a rescheduling request, and then they stalled on it for a little bit, decided to seek additional information through that expert committee, took that advice on board, which basically said there's not enough evidence for sort of broad benefit, but also not much evidence of harm, which is not the worst position to be in. And on the basis of that report, decided anyway to maintain the S9 position, which is fine for a number of very good reasons. But yeah, then to do a backflip on it, months later, I think it kind of shocked everyone quite a bit.
Well, I imagine it's good news for Psylo. A lot of people probably listening won't know about Psylo and other, I guess, early companies that are in the psychedelic medicine space. So maybe if you can take us through your background and a little bit about Psylo and how you fell into this space.
Yeah, sure. So I'm a medicinal chemist by training. So I got my PhD here in Australia, and I was always really interested in drug development, particularly in the brain sciences, neuroscience, so psychiatry and neurology. I went to postdoc at Stanford for a little bit and did learned a whole bunch of work there as you do different techniques in sort of radiochemistry, animal models of disease, a little bit of structural biology with a Nobel laureate there, which was a lot of fun. And then they got really involved in the more sort of commercial end of drug development from academia, and had some work spin out into a company there called Tranquis, which was focused on treating ALS. So I came back to Australia in 2018, with all this sort of knowledge and exposure, to join a philanthropic initiative here, the Lambert Initiative, which I'm guessing some of your listeners will be familiar with. And there my role was sort of to head the medicinal chemistry efforts, develop interesting new molecules based on the biology of cannabis, compounds found in cannabis, and develop new drugs for epilepsy and other things. So was doing that for a number of years, and we've done a lot of really good science, built out a bit of a team there, and had a lot of fun working with the Lambert. And then sort of right as my position there was wrapping up, met this really interesting guy, Josh Isman, who was a sort of repeat founder in the tech space. He was super interested in mental health and psychedelics. I just lost a friend to suicide earlier that year, and it just seemed like a very natural sort of career pivot. I'd been watching a lot of the clinical trials, the larger clinical trials run by Compass and others, and it seemed like psychedelics, this wasn't sort of some fringe area of science. This was, an area that is actually offering benefit in a, very serious clinical way.
Very interesting. Yeah. I mean, it's quite a journey. Speaking about psilocybin and MDMA being a natural kind of progression for where you're at. What's your kind of outlook on where this is going? I know we're going to be talking mostly about what's just been legalized, but I'm curious to see what you think the future of alternative medicines, let's say, could look like to include, could you see, for example, LSD or other medicines coming on board in the future beyond where we're just kind of coming to at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. One of these things, our comms officer Dr. Lara Pachechi, she uses this phrase sort of back to the future when describing the psychedelic medicine field, because there is, there has been a huge amount of medical interest in all of these substances. So in various sort of cultural contexts, obviously psilocybin containing fungi have been used for millennia, as well as other psychoactive plants. But in the Western world, the sort of discovery of LSD, which is semi-synthetic, the first psychedelic to be discovered by the West, that was rolled out by Sandoz as a psychiatric medicine. They didn't quite know what to do with it, but they were manufacturing tons of it. It had been given to sort of thousands of patients around the world, to psychiatrists themselves. Hundreds of research papers have been written on the potential promise of this. It was being used to treat everything from sort of recidivism to alcoholism to all sorts of other indications. And we kind of forget that this was a really serious area of sort of medicinal pursuit until it was shuttered by prohibition and the sort of Nixon war on drugs. And that was largely, it was largely political and cultural. You had a whole bunch of people in the US at the time not wanting to be conscripted into the Vietnam War, deciding that instead they sort of drop out of society, not going to mortgage and be conscripted, but instead maybe join these alternative communities and cultures. And that's politically a pretty destabilizing thing when you're, trying to run a country that's waging war in other parts of the world. So yeah, I think a lot of the promise of these medicines has been sort of forgotten as prohibition has stamped out research. And if you speak to people who were doing research at the time, I've met some psychiatrists who are very old now who were dosing human patients in Australia with LSD. That research basically shut it overnight. It was really like, whatever you're holding, this material needs to be returned or destroyed by the end of the week. And, all this research is coming to a halt. So I sort of view it as these being substances that did have medicinal use that was sort of temporarily banned for a period. And now we're just sort of returning to this, to exploration of the medicinal properties of a lot of these compounds.
Yeah, we sometimes joke.
Sorry, I just want to hear about the actual compounds themselves. Like everyone, I think, will have heard, at least in the last few weeks, about psilocybin, but is it psilocin? Can you maybe talk to us about other fungi compounds that may have a therapeutic effect on people?
Yeah, sure. So psilocybin is the primary compound that people think of with magic mushrooms. It's actually a prodrug. So for people who don't know what a prodrug is, it is a form of a drug that's not active in itself, that is often generated to be, more compatible with the human body in various ways. But in the body, it's metabolized to an active substance. So psilocybin is the phosphate ester of the active substance, which is psilocin. And then in the mushroom, you have, because of the biosynthetic pathways involved, you have a whole host of other things related to these. So these are all broadly in the class of tryptamines, and the tryptamine skeleton can have a number of different pendant groups. So in the case of psilocin, it's a hydroxy at the 4 position. Serotonin, which is a key neurotransmitter in our brains, that is very closely related, has that hydroxy group move 1 position around and is missing a couple of methyl groups. So the reason these drugs have any effect at all is because they're very close to chemicals that exist in our body for doing various signaling processes. So also in the mushrooms, you've got sort of various quaternary ammonium species. You have things like baeocystin, norbaeocystin, and a lot of these other compounds, they're at lower levels than psilocybin and psilocin. So they're the 2 sort of primary alkaloids of importance. But there are other substances in there. I think some of these have been shown to have not particularly potent, but monoamine oxidase inhibitory activity. So some of the enzymes that break down some of these compounds. So that there are definitely other bioactive substances in the mushrooms themselves. We often just don't know a huge amount about them in terms of their precise pharmacology, and especially not in a living system, an animal model or a human system.
So then I'm just curious about the idea. I mean, in cannabis, we talk about, strains and how you have indica dominant strains, sativa dominant strains, and loosely this is used as a dichotomy to determine what type of, but it doesn't tell you that much, to be completely honest. I'm just curious, how many, I guess, mushroom species are there that we can say are kind of, unique genetics or that you'd work with? And is there an effort on the part of scientists working in this field to say, well, you know what, this is all very unscientific, trying to determine the therapeutic efficacy of pairing this species to treat this condition? Why don't we try and isolate the psilocybin compound from the mushroom so that we can at least just dose that as an individual molecule? Like, what does that landscape look like from your scientific perspective?
So I'm a bit more of a reductionist maybe than some of your listeners, and I have worked at a very deep level of science in both the cannabis space and the psychedelic space. I used to get a bit frustrated in cannabis by all this talk of sort of entourage and strains and really, yeah.
I should fully disclose we've had Ethan Russo on the other show.
Ethan Russo, who's a big proponent of this sort of terpene hypothesis, who also runs a company selling terpenes, which to me is always a bit suspicious. He's a great guy, but I do have some issue with unsubstantiated claims broadly in science. So one of the issues in the entourage kind of field broadly is that obviously there's different cannabis morphologies for different cultivars. They produce different terpene profiles, and in some cases different levels of cannabinoids. And my basic argument is that unless I see some data, running counter to that none of those things actually mean anything in terms of subjective effect really in a meaningful way beyond sort of human expectancy bias.
Is in terms of human expectancy bias, I mean, a lot of people we see in cannabis don't really have an expectation per se, but they will report different effects from different strains. Is that something that you would challenge?
A little bit, only because I haven't seen much data to. But expectancy is not always conscious either. This is the other thing to realize. If you have strains with two different scents, for example, because of the terpene profile, you have associations there historically, sort of sensory and sort of other contextual cues that let you know what to expect maybe. And I'd say the same thing is true it happens with alcohol even, right? If you get home late on a Friday night and you have a glass of wine and you just kind of wind down for the week, you wouldn't expect that wine, would have a different effect because of the nature of the grapes or anything compared to a glass of wine that you have on a Saturday night gearing up to go for a big night out somewhere. So all these other factors are hugely important. I'd say it has more to do with the individual than the substance itself.
But certain alcohols will give one person, say, heartburn and not to another, for example.
Yeah. Physiological responses, sure, I'd agree that's possible, and that's more to do with just the nature of the mix itself, the blend. But that's that's essentially at a food level of a substance. You're eating hundreds of grams of alcohol with tens of grams of ethanol in it. So it's not a perfect analogy. My issue with the cannabis space is that you don't really, for any of these cannabinoids individually, you don't see data suggesting that they have the sort of activities that's described in a way that's really meaningful physiologically. I don't want to get too far off track on that.
Yeah.
Only because
you derailed my question, Mitch.
You're welcome.
I want to hear about whether or not. Just jump back. Isolates in psychedelic medicine. Is that a thing?
We could spend hours on the entourage thing, and I have a lot of informed opinions, and I'm a skeptic, but also open to discussion. I love discussing the topic.
And just as a tail actually on that, I'm pretty sure it still is treated as the entourage effect hypothesis. So it's there to be tested. I don't know how, anyway.
I say this as someone who has gone looking at a very molecular level and beyond. So with psychedelics, the interesting thing with psilocybin mushrooms, and this is why I hope people think that I'm a skeptic and not a naysayer, because of this sort of MAOI activity that I mentioned for some of these other minor alkaloids, there's the very real possibility that you get PK type interactions. So pharmacokinetic interactions where one substance is changing your metabolic enzymes and therefore affecting the experience based on the amount of psilocybin in the mushroom. So beyond that, there is confirmed differences in amounts of psilocybin in mushrooms. So actually our native Psilocybe subaeruginosa is one of the most potent species in the world. It has a substantially higher amount of psilocybin than Psilocybe cubensis, which was likely to have been introduced here at some point. It's one that grows in sort of cow dung, and it's the one that's most commonly cultivated. So I think there's more than 100 species of mushroom that produce psilocybin in some level. Some of them are very low, almost trace, and others are, sort of viable for commercial production and for humans to use. Psilocybe cubensis is by far the most common commercial species, that's grown. And as a result, that species itself has many cultivars, like in cannabis. And largely, these change a little bit in terms of alkaloid content. But because that's, as with cannabis, that's massively environmentally driven, you can grow the same cultivar in two different environments and get very different alkaloid levels. But it really seems to pertain most to the morphology of the mushroom, its general sort of, observable structural properties. And if you want to have a great guest on who's really, really deep into the genetics of this and gives an amazing talk on it, there's a guy named Dr. Alistair McTaggart, who's up at UQ. He's out in the wild with a government-funded grant, looking for genetic evidence of other fungal species in Australia that are native that might be capable of producing psilocybin. And they've had some interesting leads from sort of Kakadu National Park area and elsewhere. So,
wow.
Yeah.
Has he got, is it fair to say he's got the coolest job in Australia? I mean,
It's
that sounds incredible.
it's pretty great. He's a very funny, like very interesting guy, great scientist, and yeah, definitely recommend getting him on at some point to discuss the genetics a bit more.
Yeah, totally. Is the and so to kind of so you're looking at this particular species that produces high content of psilocybin. Is what would then be the process of stripping the mushroom down so that you just actually extract an isolate of psilocybin from that? Is that something that you look to do, or is it sufficient to just dry mushroom, crush it into a powder, put it in a capsule? This is the form that I imagine some people who have participated in clinical trials, whether formally or informally amongst friends, may have consumed psychedelic mushrooms.
So there are all of the above options possible, right? You can extract psilocybin from fungal material, like you can do plant extraction from cannabis raw material to get bioactives. So that's absolutely something that can happen. I'd argue it's probably more effort than it's worth when the mushrooms are, apart from a little bit of chitin and stuff, they're more or less digestible by humans. We don't have any trouble getting the psilocybin out of the mushrooms themselves. And I think for the most part, in places like Oregon and Colorado, where you've got these sort of medicalization or legalization ballot initiatives proceeding, I think that's the form it will take, much like some of the really high grade Dutch cannabis operations for medicinal use. You'll have more or less operations that are managed by the state, or sort of audited by the state, that allow you to grow high quality mushrooms as long as you can show they are of a certain purity and quality. So I think that is absolutely going to be a model that's used very broadly in a number of places. And then on the medical side, I think it's far more common, because of the requirements of medical regulators, that you'll just have the active pharmaceutical ingredient in various forms. So this will be psilocybin that's produced synthetically, in a chemical lab, the same way any of our antiviral drugs are made for COVID or anything else. And the reason that's done is because it's just very cost effective. So the Usona Institute has published a multi-kilogram scale synthesis in an open access journal, so anyone can use it, of GMP psilocybin. And it's, in terms of cost per dose, this is a drug that's taken about 25 milligrams. If you can manufacture a few kilos of it, not too expensively, that's still a very inexpensive substance compared to actually even just growing the mushrooms that are quite easy to grow, and drying them, powdering them. It's probably just easier on scale to produce this synthetically. And that's definitely the method that will be rolled out for most clinical trials and eventually through any kind of, commercial clinic network, I think.
Just curious, and this is probably a more basic point, but there's quite a few listeners that sometimes we know on cannabis, they can still get confused between like CBD and hemp seed oil. I know we see things out there at the moment, like at your local grocer, so that's like lion's mane extract and this kind of stuff. Are you able to just explain the difference between, obviously psychoactive mushrooms and what you might see on the shelves out at Woolies?
Yes, it's medicinal. Like, we're a bit of I guess Australia is not a particularly mycophilic society. We fall into the general category of mycophobic, meaning that people are kind of a bit scared of mushrooms. And if you speak to people like Jim Fuller, who's a mycologist from Fable, the food company, like we eat way too few mushrooms compared to places like Russia and elsewhere where there is a lot of foraging activity and people are very comfortable with mushrooms. So a lot of these products that you're talking about, I mean, psychoactive fungi, one of these hundreds of species of psilocybin containing mushrooms that I mentioned before. There's also a very long history of traditional use of other kinds of mushrooms with medicinal properties. So for those people that are watching The Last of Us at the moment, this idea of like a cordyceps fungus that grows in a human and takes over your brain and becomes a kind of zombie epidemic. Not strictly true, nor very likely, but that is actually based on a cordyceps species, many cordyceps species that parasitize a moth that has a larval stage in the ground and, sporulates from there. Those particular mushrooms have a long history of use in Chinese traditional medicine. For example, like lion's mane is another one that's got a long history of medicinal use. So the products that you can find in supermarkets are bioactive in that they're likely to contain extracts of mushrooms with, interesting sort of medicinal compounds, but they're not necessarily psychoactive. So they don't contain psilocybin. They're sort of extracts of other interesting medicinal compounds that happen to be found in fungus and should be treated more or less like any other supplement that you take a multivitamin or anything else based on your understanding of this.
Not like the spinach we have at Woolies, which was apparently recalled because it was in a magic mushroom field, which is interesting. I mean, what you're saying is true. Like I remember growing up and you know, being told you just don't eat mushrooms in the wild because, you know, if you don't know what they are, it can be a dangerous exercise.
That's absolutely true. So I've been foraging with people who are experts in this field out of curiosity, you know. Obviously I would never pick a Psilocybe subaeruginosa mushrooms. That'd be illegal in New South Wales. But you can go out and you can find them growing right next to very deadly Galerina species. So if you don't know what you're doing for that particular species, because you need multiple points of identification, because of the habitat that they grow in and the fact that you find deadly species of mushrooms there, I'd say it would be pretty foolhardy to go out and attempt to pick something that you can't very, you know, confidently identify as one species or another. So I think that's where a lot of this fear comes from.
Yeah.
And even every now and again, I think I'm trying to remember the specifics, but
does the New South Wales government let you pick the deadly one though? Is that?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, you can pick whatever deadly mushrooms you want, just not the subaeruginosa.
Just not the fun ones.
Yeah. So there was a case a little while back, and I'm trying to remember the details. So don't quote me on a date or location, but I think it was a fine dining restaurant in Canberra where a couple of people ended up getting very serious liver toxicity and dying. And it turned out this restaurant had bought some like exotic gourmet mushrooms from a forager who'd accidentally picked a deadly species of Amanita or something and not identified it quite correctly. So like the risks are very real. It doesn't happen very often, you know. Mushroom deaths from, you know, for culinary reasons are pretty rare. But yeah, it's definitely like anything else. I mean, you wouldn't go out and eat a berry that you didn't, you know, fully know the sort of properties of either. I think it's just very sensible that if you don't understand, you know, foods or medicines in your environment, you probably shouldn't be putting them in your mouth.
Although cannabis might be an exception to this rule, given toxicity levels. You know.
Yeah, but don't smoke something that looks like cannabis, but you don't know what it is.
If you happen to have a Japanese maple related species that was extremely toxic, you know, and you were likely to mistake it, you probably wouldn't be running around picking cannabis. But we're lucky that at least in Australia, you know, cannabis is introduced here, only sort of native to Central Asia, so it's introduced almost everywhere. In the environment, there's often not many other things that really look like it. It's pretty. You come across a 1,000 cannabis plants in the wild, it's pretty obvious what's going on there, you know.
Yeah,
it's hard to mistake the wrong cannabis plant as well when you're in somebody's you know, subterranean basement out in the hinterlands as well. It just seems to be so isolated in that bunker.
What about well, actually, just while we're talking about mushroom safety, the TGA has seemingly made this decision, but there's still no guidance around, like, for example, TGO 93, the safety and quality standard for medicinal cannabis. Has the TGA given any sort of guidance around, you know, mushrooms that is to be supplied that, you know, for psychedelic purposes, what safety standards they need to meet? Do we have any daylight on any of that?
I absolutely cannot comment on that because I haven't looked into that, to be honest, at this point, where because of the nature of my work, we're very focused on the sort of more pharmaceutical end of things. I haven't looked into it, but I assume there will be sort of guidance there from places like Oregon are definitely doing that. They're setting up, as they have done for cannabis, various standards. I'm not aware of what the TGA is doing at this point, but if their plan is to allow actual fungal material to be used in various medical ways, that I assume it'll follow the same pathway as cannabis generally, and, you know, just the details will change. Yeah.
And so I know your research is, well, you've indicated that you've done obviously a lot of research on psilocybin. Does MDMA, are there any research activities on foot or planned with respect to MDMA?
In Australia, you mean?
Yeah, and even with Psylo.
Right. So we're not focused on MDMA or that sort of class of compounds pharmacologically at all. I know that Ameria is looking at a number of sort of entactogen-inspired compounds, and there's a company run by CSO is Matt Baggett in the US called Tactogen, who's sort of also working broadly on that class. So there are definitely people looking at sort of safer or more efficacious versions of MDMA is the ultimate goal. So that's definitely an area that's work that's going on privately. And in Australia, I know Steve Bright over at Edith Cohen, I think he's running a small MDMA trial in PTSD. But yeah, there's not as much MDMA activity here as there is psilocybin clinically.
Okay. So, I mean, so in terms of, because there will be listeners that are thinking, okay, great, this decision's been made. How far away is it? Everyone's gone through the prolonged process with regard to accessing medical cannabis. I think in the first year that cannabis was legalized in Australia, there were only, a handful of special access scheme applications that were accepted. And, so preceded a deluge of applications and doctors wishing to become authorized prescribers. I'm envisaging, based on that experience, several years before it's really mainstreamed for people to be going to a clinic and having supervised psychedelic assisted medicine, psychedelic assisted therapy with these medicines. So with your, I guess, having a much clearer view on these things, are you seeing the same thing, or do you think it might happen a bit faster than that?
No, I think it's too early for anyone to say, myself or anyone else. And I think you're absolutely insightful there, Andrew, on the cannabis as sort of a proxy. So I think people are expecting that on July 1, you're going to be able to go to your psychiatrist and set up a session, and next week you'll be getting treated for PTSD. And I think based on the cannabis data you mentioned, and I know Reese Cohen tracks this in a lot of detail with respect to the number of SASB approvals. You can use that sort of as a proxy measure. It was a very long time after the law was reformed before we started seeing broader rollout, and I think this will absolutely be the same. It might be even slower unless there's dramatically more sort of public opposition, and the reason for that is that cannabis was a take-home medicine. So once the pathways are established, there's a lot of sort of public will to get things moving, but you have a framework where someone can go be prescribed a medicine in a sort of controlled way and take it home to use it. This has additional challenges because not only do you need an authorized prescriber who's the psychiatrist, it has to be, remember, it's only psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression and MDMA for PTSD. So it's very condition-specific. It's in conjunction with an approved therapy. So you're going to need the therapist who can actually roll out that treatment. It's not a take-home medicine. So you're going to need sites where this can actually be administered safely. So you have sort of additional hurdles that didn't really exist for cannabis. You can take it home and use that medicine yourself, more or less in the comfort of your own home. And that's not going to be the case here.
Also, did I read correctly that you will need 2 psychiatrists to review the actual, I guess, whether it's applicable for that patient? It's not going to be like, this is going to be much more arduous than cannabis, even if cannabis did take a long time. Like, I think that a lot of GPs, a lot of healthcare professionals who have studied psilocybin, let's say, are not psychiatrists. So they're very gung-ho on alternative medicine, psychedelic medicine, but they're not necessarily from a psychiatrist background. So I concur with that. I think we're going to see a much slower uptake on this one, unfortunately, fortunately, however you want to view it, but definitely that double psychiatrist hurdle is going to present some problems. You're going to get very highly specialized outfits that are doing this in a way that won't be like, oh yeah, give a telehealth call, get your cannabis medicine.
I think there's always a way. And the thing that what I'm envisaging is you have a couple of doctors that do Friday and Saturday night only at-home consults. So they come to you. That ticks the 2 psychiatrist box that you were just referencing, Mitch.
It has to be in a medical facility, like a medical kind of environment.
But how do you then explain GPs that do home visits?
Well, that doesn't have to take place in a medical, clinically relevant environment.
That's what I'm saying. I think you could potentially. Anyway,
you just build a studio at the house.
Yeah. And what's the definition of a medical facility? This is what I mean. There's a lot of additional restrictions here, and I'm sure people will find ways to work within those, maybe debatably around them, depending on who you ask.
Yeah,
there'll absolutely be ways to do it. But yeah, my basic point is that there just are a huge number of additional restrictions that didn't exist here for cannabis. And even that was pretty slow to get going, really, after the law was reformed. So I think, I'm optimistic that these medicines can be made available, in a way that minimizes risk to patients, that hopefully is really beneficial to patients. I'm very optimistic about that because there's certainly no shortage of people, hitting me up on Twitter and by email saying they're sort of at the end of the line and they're looking for some direction in terms of trial availability. but we do want to balance the benefits with the risks. That's what any good sort of medical regulator should be doing. And I think in this particular space, that's why the tone is a little bit more sort of conservative, and I think as a result, it'll be a little bit slower to be deployed. So
yeah. Do we know if anyone's actually had access, like lawful access yet? It's only been a week.
I haven't done any calling around to find out, but I'd be very surprised. So the step, we know what the steps are. So like the first step is like who else beyond the psychiatrists who are prescribing for the current special access trials that are happening, who else has been made an authorized prescriber? Like that's the first step, right? So like hopefully someone by FOI or otherwise can work out who's actually able to to prescribe these things. That's the first step, is getting more psychiatrists who can prescribe. So
is an AP necessary, or can you do SASB applications?
I'm not actually sure. I believe AP is necessary for the S8 rescheduling, definitely.
Right. Okay.
I believe psychiatrists are involved in the prescription to the administering psychologists, who are the therapists in the current clinical trials.
Who's defined the requirements to become an AP?
I assume this would be the TGA or maybe the colleges. I haven't looked in that level.
Yeah, it's probably possibly NIM or something like that.
Yeah, I know there is the role of an ethics committee, obviously, as part of that authorized prescriber process. But yeah, I suppose the thing that when we talk about all these barriers to access, and I remember just shaking my head so often in the early days of medical cannabis, when you really saw people, I mean, this idea of, well, you have to be treatment resistant. Well, what if you're on an SSRI or some, psychedelic medicine, or, psychotic medicine that somebody just hands out to you like candy at your GP. You get a script for Lexapro or something at the moment you tell them, I had a bad day at work. Let's say that actually assists you in terms of just managing symptoms, but doesn't actually go to root cause or anything that underlies your mental illness. Does that mean that effectively, because that masks the symptoms, that you wouldn't fall into the category of being treatment resistant?
It's an interesting point. I only just thought that maybe if that's a specific technical definition and requirement, maybe see an uptick in people seeking multiple SSRI treatments in order to become treatment resistant.
Yeah.
As an interesting consequence. I don't know. Treatment resistant, I forget what the specific definition is that's used in Australia, but it's definitely that you've failed to respond to several medicines. I forget what the exact number is for depression. So yeah, I think, I'd also, sort of, as a devil's advocate, argue that if you're treating the symptoms of the condition, which is more or less how we diagnose a lot of these things, unfortunately, for better or for worse, if you're getting response from Lexapro or some other SSRI, then that would be considered remission, right? And of course, that's not to say that that's the best treatment for people with depression, because we know there's emotional flattening, we know there's a lot of different side effects. But I think these treatments will become more broadly available, and for people who are, for any reason, maybe not resistant to the SSRIs, but have other sort of seriously limiting adverse effects or side effects to those drugs, this provides sort of an alternative treatment path.
Yeah, well, I think we've just kind of accepted as part of mainstream medicine this idea that you could just be on a particular medication indefinitely without actually trying to really cure whatever that condition is. Yeah, that's why the promise of these psychedelic medicines is just so enormous when you really hear about people just living with debilitating PTSD and other conditions, major depression for years on end, and they finally turn a corner with psychedelic medicines. And they're able to actually give up their daily medication that they were on previously. I know that won't be the case for everyone. So in the spirit of a fair and balanced discussion, we need to temper the promise of these medicines with that reality that, they won't necessarily work for everyone, but there is a lot of hope out there that wasn't previously even able to be considered in Australia. I mean, is that how you see it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like I'm not a massive I'm trying to find the right word here, but I'm not a completely unreserved advocate for these things. Like I'm a very evidence-based person. I like
psychonaut.
Yeah, I'm not an absolute psychonaut. It should be in your breakfast cereal every day, but I think like with all medicines, we just need to balance the sort of risks and benefits. And in this case, I think based on the data that we've seen so far for some of these very serious conditions, the data are extremely promising, and it warrants, additional trials and really thinking about how to structure these things. And the risks are real in treatment-resistant depression or major depressive disorders, PTSD even. There are some people who end up in a worse position after participating in these trials, and that might be that they have this sort of catalytic experience that's very challenging to work through, and they don't necessarily get the right sort of integration support afterwards. And there are reports of these, if you look at sort of patient testimonies and other things. Some people actually do end up worse after these trials. They're also some of the most seriously depressed patients in the world. And it's absolutely appropriate for any medicine, to be a panacea. Otherwise, we fully expect that some people won't respond as well as others, or may even get worse. So I think just balancing expectations and really considering the benefits versus the risks is just the main thing here. That's a really pragmatic approach. They're not going to be perfect for everyone, and they're also, not these super dangerous drugs. It's just finding that middle ground.
Absolutely. We'll wrap up because we know you're a busy man, and you would have been very busy over this last bit. I've just got one final one for you. I mean, if, for example, 5 years from now, we have I guess a growing number of clinics that are offering people access to psychedelic medicines, do you think one day we might see things like DMT or the Toad 5-MeO DMT being rolled out in these clinics, or is that pipe dreams on Andrew's part, and I should just keep those to myself?
No, I think it's very likely. So really, the reason people are doing so many trials with psilocybin compared to LSD, for example, even though there's an interesting study out of Basel from Matthias Liechti's group showing that apart from the duration of action in people with limited psychedelic experience, subjectively, people actually can't really tell the two apart. This is why I find like the sort of counter to the entourage hypothesis so interesting. You give people LSD and psilocybin and ask them 2 hours in what they got, blinded, and they can't really tell you. Like, that's how similar some of these drugs are and how profound they can have on consciousness. So a lot of the work's going with psilocybin because it's just more practical right now and seems to have some therapeutic benefit. There are also trials going on right now with DMT and with 5-MeO DMT by various startups. Some of the DMT trials are showing efficacy in depression, which is one of the indications. And sort of experts in the field were unsure if, because of the sort of trajectory of the DMT experience, it might not be as useful as psilocybin for treating depression. But so far, the trials data is looking quite promising in these small studies. And DMT has also been used for stroke recovery on the basis of some really promising data from a rat model. So there's a human trial going on now looking at that. So I think this is really just the beginning. You're going to see a couple of drugs rolled out because the clinical evidence is at a standard where it needs to be. But really, people are just starting to really reinvestigate this entire arena of medicines that's been more or less forbidden for, in terms of research for the past 40, 50 years.
Well, we're so grateful that you and others are championing the cause of pulling out those books off the shelf, dusting them off, and really picking up where we left off where we wrapped up in the 60s. So credit to you and the team at Psylo, and I know there are others as well who are really pushing to take this forward, and ultimately with the goal of at least helping some Australians get access to these medicines, which will hopefully have profound impacts on their lives. And just a sort of a tail end to that is just to say that, in Victoria, we had a whole royal commission into our mental health system that I know was watched closely by other states. And we have so many people in this country that could be potentially assisted by this. So, and that would just be wonderful for our public health system in terms of what it has to deal with on an annual basis. So I'm very much along for the ride. We'll be watching what Psylo and others do in this space very closely. So Sam, thank you so much for joining us. I'm sure we'll chat to you at some stage in the future as everything begins to unfold.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks so much for the conversation, Andrew and Mitch, and thanks for having me on. Great to have a chat and a great way to start the day with some really, sort of invigorating discussion.
Indeed. All right. Well, until next time, Sam, take care. We'll speak soon.
See you soon.
All right.
Thanks, Sam. Cheers.
Hey guys, Andrew Dowling here and Mitch Kurtz. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the AltMed podcast.
Make sure to hit like and subscribe because we've got heaps more content coming out and it's really fun and great and we love it all.
Also very good.